Thank you. Good morning. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for the promises of the Word of God that we can stand on and count on in times of need and times of loss. We just pray that you will always help us to keep those passages and verses in mind. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, I'm recording this again early today because we have some other things at church during the usual hour. I'm going to call this Going Viral. It was, again, another week where we saw a convergence of events, not necessarily events that fulfill Bible prophecy, but events that point to the eventual fulfillment of Bible prophecy. There's probably some things I'm not going to be able to cover today just because of time constraints, but it was another very interesting week. It is a disrupted world. Now I'm going to just read a few verses to kind of place some things in context that I'd like to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the usual way that I break these down is I talk about some cultural things that are going on in the world and in the church, sometimes both, that indicate a great time of moral disruption, moral failure, apostasy in the church. And then I talk about geopolitics in the Middle East and some other things. And of course, this week we have some plagues and pestilence to talk about. So let me just read a few verses for some context. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3. This is talking about the church. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust shall they heap to themselves teachers, having itching ears. And they shall turn away their ears from the truth, and shall be turned unto fables. Now, this is talking about people in the church. They will turn away voluntarily from the truth and will listen to fables, things that aren't true, made up things. But Paul's admonition to Timothy is, but watch thou in all things, endure afflictions, do the work of an evangelist, make full proof of thy ministry. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, Paul had written to Timothy as well, and said, now the Spirit speaketh expressly. So when the Spirit speaketh expressly, that means you really need to pay attention, that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from meats, which God hath created to be received with thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth. We also know that in Romans chapter 1, Paul had also written to the church at Rome and told them that people would depart away from the natural things. Men would lust after women, and men would lust after men, and women after women, and give themselves up. And God, in what Paul said, was that God gives them over to a judgment, and the judgment is that God gives them over to a reprobate mind, meaning they lose the ability to reason. Another thing I think that we see sort of cycling back, and if you understand Jewish prophecy is often cyclical. There is an early fulfillment and a later fulfillment, maybe later fulfillments, and there's a pattern. And one of the early patterns is set forth in Genesis chapter 11. And they said, this is in Babel, after the flood, and they said, let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach into heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Excuse me. Continues. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they all have one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. And this is something that we see, I think, through the development of technology, the police state, surveillance, is through the use of technology, people in that community have essentially said they will be like gods. There will be a singularity. We will be able to become like gods. Now, they may not say that expressly, but that's certainly the subtext of what they are really saying. So I'm going to look at some cultural things again, and then some geopolitics. So if you want to jump to the geopolitics of the Middle East, you can fast forward through this. Now, I just want to say that we live at a time where there is incredible disruption in our politics. The parties don't even get along with the people within their own parties. We have a presidential election coming up. There were reports this week that the intelligence community went to Congress and presented supposedly intel findings that Russia was going to assist President Trump in this year's election. Now, I saw Robert C. O'Brien, who's the national security advisor to the president, and he said, I've looked at what they were told, and there was no intelligence there. They were just told that there was going to be interference. You notice they never said specifically, this is how things are going to be done. They later, Bernie Sanders came out and said that, yes, they had advised his campaign that Russia was going to interfere on behalf of Bernie Sanders and help him get the nomination or get elected. Now, I'm very skeptical of anything that comes out of Russia. They engaged in, when it was the Soviet Union, they had probably 1 million people employed to engage in subterfuge and propaganda. So I think this is just sort of a cheap way for the Russians to keep the Americans in a disrupted state, that they will be in a place where they won't agree, so that regardless of who gets elected, if it's Bernie Sanders gets elected, or if it's Donald Trump who gets elected, the other side will never ever accept it, and they will say, well, they were only elected because of Russian influence. And so be very careful when you see these claims coming out of the intelligence community, particularly when they don't tell you how this is going to be done or what it is that Russia is doing. In the last election, the theory is that the Russians intervened on behalf of Trump, and there was some allegation that they had spent something like $300,000 on Facebook ads. And I have yet to meet a single person who was influenced in their vote in the 2016 election in any way by something they saw on Facebook or social media or anything like that. So I think this is overblown, it's hype, and I do believe that it's a way for the Russians to keep Americans not unified, fighting with each other, and that sort of thing. In the current issue of Foreign Affairs, and yes, I understand that Foreign Affairs is published by the Council on Foreign Relations, and I know that the Council on Foreign Relations is largely a globalist type, New World Order type organization, although they do have people that contribute writings to them that are not globalist in nature. So they do draw from a broad spectrum, but of course they have their basic editorial focus and bias. One of the things that they talk about here is the epidemic of despair. Will America's mortality crisis spread to the rest of the world? What they're noticing is that there's a very large increase in things that indicate that people are despairing of things. There's a rise in drug addiction, there's a rise in suicides, and it is a big problem in the United States. And the concern that they're expressing here is, will it spread to the rest of the world? And this is interesting when these sort of ultimate life and death issues come from a globalist organization, that they are concerned about these things. Now, I'm going to lead into this with one little story from the LA Times the other day. And then there's this next section is going to be a little bit longer because there's, I think, a very important thing that's going on. I think it does fit into Bible prophecy. But if you note here the headline, this is in yesterday's Los Angeles Times, rapid changes strain the Ninth Circuit. They went out. What they've noticed is people know the Ninth Circuit has been a seedbed of a lot of really crazy ideas over the past couple of decades because they were controlled, mainly it was controlled pretty extensively by democratically appointed judges. President Trump in his first term has appointed more circuit court judges than Obama did in all 8 years that he was in office. And what's happening is that what used to be left-leaning circuits are now flipping to be more middle of the road to conservative circuits because of the type of judges that President Trump has appointed. So it's really one of the really good things I can point to that's coming out of the Trump administration is that this has a long-term impact. The judges that he's appointing are very often younger. These are lifetime appointments. As people seem to be living longer, a lot of these men will be on the bench for 30 years. There was a local judge here in Columbus who was appointed by President Kennedy when he was, I think it was President Kennedy, when he was 60, and he was on the bench for 34 years. He was on the bench till he was 94. So, and the president who appointed him was, long gone by the time the judge came off of the bench. So these are very important things, and these do have, unfortunately, an outsized influence on politics and that type of thing, given the way the judges have interpreted the Constitution. So they're very concerned in the Ninth Circuit, and the judges on the Ninth Circuit that were appointed by Democratic presidents are like, well, these people don't know what they're doing. They have to learn on the job. Not ignoring the fact that they themselves were in the same position at one time. So there's a lot of people upset that the Ninth Circuit, which had been the most liberal probably of all the circuits in the United States court system, is now flipping to be conservative. Now, the article that I want to focus on is a cover article by Andy McCarthy. He was one of the prosecutors of the blind shake in connection with the first World Trade Center bombing. Got a successful conviction of that a group of Islamists that had attacked the World Trade Center back during the Clinton administration. And he has a very important article. I don't know if it's behind a paywall or not, but I'll quote extensively from it. And I want you to listen to this because in the Bible it says that one of the things that will happen in the end times is that, and Jesus said this to his disciples, you will be brought before magistrate and judges. And so this is something that I think we need to pay attention to. I've often said that the person in the criminal justice system that you need to be concerned about the most is a rogue prosecutor. They can really disrupt your life. We see many times that people are convicted of process crimes. For example, in connection with the probe about communist influence, the Mueller probe, they really never found any evidence that there was actual Russian influence on that. But people were brought before FBI. I read that, I think it was Katie McFarland, who was a national security person. She spent somewhere between 32 and 40 hours being grilled by federal prosecutors. And she herself said recently in an interview this week that I got to the point where I just wanted to say, just tell me what you want me to say and I'll say it. And believe me, I have personal knowledge that this is how this goes. And if you lie in an FBI interview, and a lot of times they will ask you questions about, well, did you ever write to so-and-so? But they will never show you the email. So it becomes a memory test. And if you forget or say you don't remember incorrectly, they will charge you with perjury or lying to a federal officer. And that's how people end up in prison. And there's a shift that's going on among prosecuting attorneys in the United States, largely funded by George Soros and others on the progressive left. Listen to what Andy says in this article. A newly minted district attorney for a major American city vows to establish an immigration unit. At first blush, that would seem entirely normal for a prosecutor's office. Immigration laws require enforcement, and prosecutors are in the law enforcement business. But no, the new San Francisco DA actually has in mind an immigration defense unit. He wants to assign a staff of prosecutors to protect undocumented aliens, those who are either illegal and thus deportable to begin with, or for whom a criminal conviction would result in a loss of lawful status and thus eventual deportation. The unit's enforcement target would not be the law violators, but the immigration and custom enforcement agents who enforce federal laws, along with any local police and corrections office officials who have the temerity to assist ICE in that endeavor. The prosecutor's mission, in the words of their new boss, would be to stand up to Trump on immigration, the president having made signature issues of border security and the stepped-up deportation of aliens who flout the laws. That kind of immigration unit is not something you'd expect to find in a district attorney's office. But of course, neither would you expect upon this new DA's election a victory party marked by the ear-splitting chants of blank, with the F word, POA. The POA is the Police Officers Association. For such law enforcers, the obstruction of immigration law enforcement barely scratches the surface. The agenda here is to obstruct prosecution itself. It is, to quote Chesa Boudin, the newly elected progressive prosecutor in San Francisco described above, a, quote, movement rejecting the notion that to be free, we must cage others. And then Andy goes on to say this, may I introduce you then to a new and uniquely destructive actor on the 21st century scene, the progressive prosecutor. He goes on to note some statistics. For example, the nation's violent crime rate blasted from 161 crimes per 100,000 people in 1960 to 364 a decade later, and it reached a terrifying summit of 758 per 100,000 in 1991. This has led to some crazy ideas, particularly coming out of California, it seems, where researchers in the criminal justice field have said, prison populations have risen and crime has gone down and we don't understand how this has happened. This doesn't make any sense to us. Well, when you look at things through the lens that they look through, that wouldn't make sense to you, but they don't have common sense. As I noted in Romans chapter 1, people on many levels, and this is prophetic, they're going to lose and progressively lose even more the ability to reason. And so what's happening now is that a lot of prosecutors are coming into the system that have been steeped in leftist ideology. I went to law school back in the 1970s. I went to graduate school in the 1970s. And I can tell you, I went from a Christian college to a state university. And at that state university, I was inundated in a criminal justice program, master's program, with Marxist and leftist ideology. This was 44 years ago. It's only gotten worse. And so what's happened is these prosecutors, they have grown up in a period of time where the crime rate has fallen dramatically. For example, in New York, In the past 30 years, Andy notes, violent crime in New York City has plummeted an astonishing 70%. In 1990, there were 2,245 people murdered in 1 year in New York City. In 2018, that number had fallen to 289, a decline of 80%. But that's not good enough for the progressives. Now, prosecutors have a discretion as to whether they're going to prosecute a crime or not. Now, if they prosecute a crime and they do things incorrectly, there are checks and balances in the criminal justice system that allows people to challenge what they've done. The problem is, as Andy notes in this article pretty extensively, is that there's nothing to do when a prosecutor decides not to prosecute things. So what we are seeing with what we are seeing with regard to a lot of different things in the criminal justice system is that prosecutors of bail reform and that type of thing, particularly in New York, people are not prosecuting certain crimes. In Los Angeles, they essentially said they're going to treat property theft up to $1,000 as a misdemeanor, and you're not really going to get any time for that. Well, guess what's happening? Property crime, less than $1,000, is skyrocketing. And people, they write to me all the time and they say, you wouldn't believe what's going on in the store where I work. People just come in and take things brazenly, and they know that nothing will happen to them. So what's happened is that these progressive prosecutors are coming into the system, and they're simply just not prosecuting certain crimes. As Andy notes, prosecutorial discretion, picking and choosing which cases to pursue, should be and has historically been unremarkable. But like any discretion authority, it can be abused. And what we're seeing is abuse of the decision not to prosecute certain crimes. Now, he goes on to describe a couple of prosecutors that are in the news currently. One is this Bowden guy in San Francisco. The other is Kimberly Fox in Chicago. Both of these people were put in place and helped in their campaigns by funds from George Soros organizations. And it's being very disruptive to the criminal justice system. For example, Bowden himself was the son of, his parents were weather underground terrorists. You might remember the famous attempted Brinks robbery. They went to prison. When he was left essentially an orphan, he was then picked up. He was raised by Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers, who were themselves these radical leftist terrorists who even Bill Ayers admit, we got away with it. So he's been steeped in this leftist ideology his whole life. Similarly with Kimberly Fox, with regard to the Jussie Smollett case, when he made up a hoax hate crime, she declined to prosecute. Now a special prosecutor has come in and charges have been filed against him. So what we see is this breakdown in the system. This is all part of the end times things. We see this lawlessness increasing. Now, I've talked about this. I talk about this every week, it seems like, and I almost feel like I'm beating a dead horse. And last week somebody asked the question was, why do you even talk about this transgender thing? What does this have to do with Bible prophecy? And I would submit to you that it has everything to do with Bible prophecy, because it is striking at the very core of how God designed creation, humanity, human sexuality. And it is tearing at the fabric of that, and it's being done for a very specific reason. Again, as it says in Romans chapter 1, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. Apologize. I seem to be having a little bit of an issue there this morning with some allergies or something. But so you see this article. This is from the Times of London. There's an editorial piece in the Times of London on Saturday. Giving puberty blockers to trans children is a leap into the unknown. Even secular people are picking up on this, yet people continue to hurtle down the road towards towards giving this these puberty blockers to people. And it's insane. It really doesn't make any sense. So this is what I think is one of the biggest indicators that we live in the end times, that this stuff is not only accepted, it's also celebrated, and it's pushed on children with no scientific evidence to back up the use of these drugs other than someone's feelings. And as this article notes, let me pull out a quote from this article because I think it's pretty important. It says this: 11-year-old child is probably years from his or her first kiss, yet the drug they are about to take will almost certainly lead to a medical pathway that will leave them sterile. Since their gametes will never be allowed to mature, doctors will not even be able to harvest their sperm or eggs. Can any 11-year-old child understand the gravity of ruling out ever having children? And it talks about the fact that these things are not even considered. There's no proof that these drugs will even work. There is, it says here, clinicians believe that the natural cascade of sex hormones at puberty can resolve bodily self-hatred. Yet if puberty is thwarted, this cannot happen. Moreover, the claim that these blockers are fully reversible, that natal puberty will just spark up even years later if you stop taking them, is largely untested because almost no one does that. They talk about a Dutch protocol. And it says that a lot of this is coming about because of activist pressure. Now, this is a secular newspaper that's pointing this out. Yet, if you point this out, they call you a bigot, transphobia, and all this other thing. Here's how it concludes. Doubts about puberty blockers have come from senior clinicians, from LGBT campaigners worried that gender clinics are performing gay conversion therapy on future homosexual kids, and from feminists appalled that girls who do not conform to sexist gender stereotypes feel they cannot be girls. Already a growing number of detransitioners, mainly young women, are coming forward angry that doctors rush them into irreversible treatment. How will this play out in the next decade? As the first cohort on puberty blockers comes to terms with their probable infertility, such experimental pediatric medicine has been politicized and shrouded in secrecy for too long. It is time to ask serious questions. So this is a secular newspaper that's raising these issues. And frankly, as an observer of this, and there's an organization called Christian Concerns, which has a good article and publication they put out this week from the UK about this. People are running headlong and doing this and they're enacting laws that prohibit you from saying anything about it. It's insanity, and people have lost the ability to reason. So yes, I do think it has something to do with Bible prophecy. I think it's directly related to Bible prophecy. And Bible prophecy is not just about geopolitics. It is about apostasy in the church. It is about falling away from the truth. And it is about perversion in society. And it is about a society where people think they can become and act like they're gods. This is what happened in Genesis chapter 11. And the whole thing is recycling again in a somewhat different form, but the result, God's judgment, will be the same. So, let's look at some of the things going on. Now, we've talked about pestilence and plagues and that sort of thing. This is happening in our world. This is an article from a South African newspaper and the article is The Year of the Locusts. You can see they gave it a 2-page spread. Across Africa, across the Middle East, and now moving into areas of Pakistan, India, and even China, is an unusual plague of locusts. These things are going into fields in Africa. When they come through, it turns the sky black. They go into a field, and they have eaten through farmers' fields, acres of vegetation in growing crops in 30 seconds. Now, it's estimated that the increase in these locusts will increase by hundreds of times over the hundreds of billions that are estimated to be in existence. It could go up 500 or more times over the next few months as the weather, spring comes and the weather changes in the different places where these are being found. This is, in some respects, at least in recent memory, this is unprecedented. And listen, this is one of the things that is prophesied to come about in the end times. Now, first, I don't think this is the actual end times, pestilence, plagues, and that type of thing. However, it is a very good picture of how this can unfold in our world. We live in a different world than 100 years ago. 100 years ago, 150 years ago, the fastest mode of transportation was generally a horse. Now people travel everywhere. Because people travel everywhere, it's allowing things like this particular pestilence, the coronavirus, to spread. They have not yet officially labeled it a pandemic. It's certainly an epidemic, but as I've been watching and reading as this unfolds, there is, first of all, there's it's difficult to determine exactly what's going on, because I still think that China has not been very transparent. Other countries where this is broken out have not been transparent either. Now, this may be because they don't want people to know the true extent of it, or it may also be, or maybe a combination of the fact that they don't know exactly how to deal with it. For example, in the United States, 47, all 50 states have testing kits. Only 3 states have testing kits that actually work. Those being, I think, California, Nebraska, and Illinois. So the rest of the states don't even have the ability to test precisely with confidence about the coronavirus. So this is an example. This is a picture of an airport in Iraq where people are returning from Iran. Now, until this week, Iran had been very unclear as to whether they were having an outbreak. One of the newspapers that has been pretty good at covering the outbreak is a newspaper called the Epoch Times. Now, I want to make a caveat about the Epoch Times. The Epoch Times is published. It has a anti-communist, conservative bent to it, but with a lot of what I would call mysticism built into parts of the newspaper. So the news pages are usually pretty accurate, but you need to be careful with going too far into the newspaper because they came out of this Falun Gong cult, I guess is the best way, of spiritual mysticism cult in China that was persecuted by the Chinese government. And they've started this. Now, they do some good journalistic works, but I want you to understand that. But they've covered this very well. And so we have this situation where, you know, they quarantined a cruise ship in Japan. Some of those people have returned to the United States now. People are upset that they returned. People are upset they weren't returned sooner. Part of the problem with quarantining them on the cruise ship was the air system was shared. It's not, each room is not separated. And people that maybe would not have gotten sick have gotten sick, and at least 2 of the passengers have died. Some of those people were returned to California, and I believe the Orange County authorities sued the federal government to say, we don't want these people. We don't want them here. There are also reports that people who have returned from China have voluntarily, in the United States, have voluntarily quarantined themselves. No, I've not been to China, by the way, in case you're asking. I've not been exposed to anybody who's been to China. But so these people, and there's no clear term or clear information about how many people have self-quarantined, although the California people have said that there are about 5,400 in California alone who are have engaged in self-quarantine to protect others. So the exact extent of this is unknown. It does seem to focus more on older men, smokers, people with lung problems, and that sort of thing. But again, the data is still developing. I've seen some video out of China about how they're training people to deal with this and sort of take people into custody, like at a checkpoint, and it's concerning. And you know, we all want to be about civil liberties, but what if it breaks out in the United States? What's the proper response? What are people supposed to do? What are public health officials supposed to do to prevent the spread? If in fact they can prevent the spread. Back in the flu virus after World War I, when about 100 million people died worldwide, eventually what the data showed was that cities with strict quarantine had death rates as high as cities that really didn't have any quarantine at all or very rudimentary quarantine procedures. And a lot of people die from the regular flu anyway, but this one seems to be a little bit different. Now, the other thing that they're saying is that there's been an outbreak of the coronavirus in China prisons. And this is very concerning because people live in close quarters in prisons. And the question is, China's put a lot of people in prisons because they're dissidents. And is China even going to do anything to take care of some of those prison populations if the coronavirus breaks out there? And again, here's the article that says only 3 states can test for coronavirus because the kits that they have are flawed. And there's been some concern about the kits in China, and they may not be giving accurate results. The Wall Street Journal the other day had an interesting article on a Singapore conference spreads coronavirus globally. They also have this article, and this has happened in Singapore and South Korea now. The article on the right-hand side of the page says virus surge in Korea tied to mega church. Now, the church that's involved is, in South Korea term, is pretty much considered to be a cult. They believe that accepting medical care is inappropriate, that it's a sin to seek out the help of a doctor and that type of thing. It's sort of a faith healing, word of faith cult. So and there's also a large church in Singapore which is tied to this. And it just takes one person. One person goes there and there's 1,000 people there, and those 1,000 people go home and they infect the 5, 10, 20, 1,000 people that they come in contact to or expose them. And so with regard to this conference, they did this little graphic in the Jerusalem Post, just tracking what happened with 3 of the 15 people that attended this conference in Singapore and how it spread. One went to South Korea, one went to Malaysia, one went to France, exposed somebody who then went to Spain, somebody in France went to the UK. And so when they find out about this, for example, in the megachurch, they think that 1,000 people were exposed, and they have to go out and investigate and try to see everybody that they've been exposed to, and it's taxing the resources of organizations everywhere. With regard to the megachurch, it said this local health official said Saturday that South Korea had 346 coronavirus cases, more than doubling in the past day and rising nearly tenfold from the start of the week. The country also reported its second death. More than half of the cases are linked to the Shenzhen Church of Jesus, located in the southeastern city of Daegu. Shenzhen means new heaven and earth in Korean, is a church that the South Korean government recently referred to as a Korean cult. Now, one place where the coronavirus has broken out has been in Iran. Iran, I'll talk about this in a minute, had elections this week for their parliament. And in connection with the elections, they didn't say anything publicly about people being infected with the coronavirus. And the first I heard of it, the authorities came out and said that 4, and I think the numbers reach 6 or 7, have died from the coronavirus, most of them in the city of Qom, QOM. It's the holy Shiite city in Iran. And 4 people had died there. Now, somebody who was in Iran from Lebanon returned home, and they've been diagnosed in Lebanon with the coronavirus. In Iran, though, the question is, how did Iranians get the coronavirus? I don't know the origins of the coronavirus. There is some suggestion that it was leaked intentionally or unintentionally from a bioweapons research lab in Wuhan. Wuhan has long been the center of bioweapons research in China. There's a 1981 novel, I can't remember the title of it, by a man named Dean Koontz. And in it, he told a story about how there was an outbreak of a bioweapon that came out of a lab in Wuhan, China. And a lot of people are making a big deal. Oh, look, he's predicting that this is what's going to happen. Now, I would suggest, I always prefer the simpler explanation. I think it's very clear that a lot of novelists, they research things. If they're going to write about a particular place, they want to build sort of a factual basis for their novels. And so he would have researched this, and he would have known that back in the 50s, this bioweapons research lab was established in Wuhan, China. Now, is there a connection between Wuhan and the city of Qom in Iran? Well, Qom is the area in Iran where they have a lot of their nuclear and other weapons, bioweapons research facilities. I suspect that there is some kind of connection between bioweapons research in China and bioweapons research in Iran. So whether this was intentional or not, the fact of the matter is that this virus has come out. I saw a report in the Global Times just this morning. The Global Times is a Chinese government mouthpiece. It essentially puts out information from the Chinese government that supports the Chinese government. It said, well, we've pretty much concluded now that the virus did not originate in the market in China, what they call a wet market, where they have these sort of, like bat soup and these other foods that you don't usually find at fast food places here in America or elsewhere. And so they're pretty much discounting that even in the Chinese government. Now we have these people, Tehran's being accused, the Tehran government, of covering this up, mainly to allow people to get out and vote in the parliamentary elections. This was also reported in the Baghdad Post. I have not been able to confirm this, so I will say verify this as best as you can, that the new Iranian Revolutionary Guard Al-Quds force leader who replaced Soleimani has been infected with the coronavirus. There were also reports that 2 of the people elected to parliament in the elections the other day in Iran also have the coronavirus. I will note that at least currently, when I look at the plague of locusts that's sweeping over parts of the Middle East and Africa, and the coronavirus erupting in China, I cannot discount the possibility that this is related to actions taken to persecute Christians in these countries, and also in China to not only persecute Christians, but also to issue an edict recently within the last couple of months that says you have to rewrite the Bible. So you have to rewrite the Bibles to conform to the goals of the socialist government. So the Iranians had an election, and pretty much hardliners that support the current Ayatollah-run regime won. Now, what happened was that there were other people who tried to run for office in this parliamentary election, but the government shut them down. This is what happens in Iran all the time. They just won't let you run. So, for example, Rouhani, who is very often portrayed as the moderate Iranian leader, he doesn't get to run unless the government supports him. Ahmadinejad never got to run, only got to run for his office, the president's office, because the regime supported him. And it's probably likely that when they have 7 or 8 candidates for the president, these all meet the approval of the Ayatollahs. Same thing with the parliament. So they elected probably an even more hardline parliament than they currently have. So while there are riots and protests going on, understand that the Ayatollahs are doubling down on protecting their regime. Seth Fransman has a good article in this morning's Jerusalem Post, essentially saying that the government appears to have covered this up. They're trying to stop media reporting on it. There are even protests and riots that are taking place. I've seen videos of them in Iran where they're protesting people being taken to facilities to be put in quarantine. They don't want them. So Seth had in his article that he wrote, it's up at the Middle East Center for Reporting, he shows some of the outbreaks that have occurred in different places and throughout the Middle East. I don't think I have the article, but there's an article on the front page of this morning's Jerusalem Post talking about the problems that are developing in Israel. And there's a real concern amongst some Israelis that I've talked to that the Ayatollahs, like Hezbollah in Lebanon and other Iranian-backed people in Lebanon, will, for lack of a better term, weaponize people who get the coronavirus and somehow send them into Israel to infect as many people as possible. And this is a real concern. Now, what's happened in Israel is that there was a group of South Koreans that were visiting, taking a tour of Israel, and they've returned to South Korea, but they found that there's been an outbreak among those people of the coronavirus. So now they're going through Israel trying to find the people who had contact with that particular tour group while they were in Israel. So this is a big problem, and governments everywhere are seeing these things break out, and they don't know what to do with it. One country that we don't hear anything about is Syria. It is difficult for me to believe that the conditions that people are living in Syria, which are some of the worst conditions in the world, given the now 9-year-long civil war that's taken place there, that this virus has not broken out. There are concerns in the Kurdish regions of northern Iraq that the coronavirus is coming there. So this is a big problem. The other thing that this coronavirus is doing is that it is essentially collapsing world markets and supply chains. You can see down here, stocks are falling on the virus concerns. There are, I think I mentioned last week, container ships that would carry 20,000 shipping containers leaving China with less than 2,000. Shipping rates have collapsed. Tourism is dropping. Visits to Hong Kong are down 90% in a month by international tourists. Many major conferences are being canceled. There are even questions as to whether the Olympics will take place in Tokyo later this year. London offered to take over and host the Olympics. I don't know that that's a good thing. I don't even know if the Olympics will take place at this point. And this thing could die out very quickly. It could go away. We have to acknowledge that. But right now, it's a problem. In China, which is one of the world's largest markets, car sales from January to February declined 92%. Supply chains factories aren't running. 96%, I think the number is 96% of the antibiotics used in the United States come from are manufactured in China. I've heard that Beijing is effectively on lockdown. It's one of the most, it's the capital of China. It's one of the most important cities on the planet. It's even causing conflicts to develop. For example, here's this article from yesterday's Wall Street Journal. Saudis weigh breaking with Russia over outlook for oil. Oil demand in China is approaching being down 50%. People are staying home, they're not working. Less demand for oil means the oil prices will go down. The only way to keep those oil prices from going down even further is for oil-producing countries to voluntarily, in cooperation with others, to cut production to keep the price where it needs to be. It's already below what Saudi Arabia needs. It's already below what Russia needs to fund their governments. Saudi Arabia has a big sovereign wealth fund that they can back it up, but Russia does not have that. Russia, they want to keep selling oil. They want to keep selling gas. Saudi Arabia announced this week that they're moving into gas production, which they have not really, natural gas production, which they have not really been in. They're developing some facilities. So this is causing some geopolitical tension between Russia and Saudi Arabia. Here's an article about insurers. Insurers are effectively immunized from the virus costs, this article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday says. In the business interruption insurance is something that businesses buy, but because of what happened with the SARS virus back around 2003, 2004, and the business interruptions that occurred then, the insurers exclude that from coverage. So whatever economic costs or losses that are taking place are not going to be covered by insurance. That further depresses markets and that type of thing. So this is a big problem. Here's one of my concerns. This is again an article on the current issue of Foreign Affairs, the digital dictators, how technology strengthens autocracy. So just listen to what this article says and put this in the context of how people might react to this. And know that while this may not be and probably is not the pestilence that we read about in Revelation and that Jesus was referring to that occurs during the seal judgments. The fact of the matter is that there is coming a time, and with the growth of technology, is how would a world leader use that to his advantage, whether the pestilence is intentional or unintentional. But let's say it gets out. How would a dictator, a world dictator, or someone who wants to be the world dictator, how would that person use technology to deal with that? Would he use technology to identify the people who have the virus or not? Listen to what the beginning of this article says. It says this: in the wake of the apparent triumph of liberal democracy after the Cold War, police states of the kind that developed in West Germany and Russia no longer seem viable. Global norms about what constituted a legitimate regime had shifted. At the turn of the millennium, new technologies, including the internet and the cell phone, promised to empower citizens, allowing the individuals greater access to information and the possibility to make new connections and build new communities. But this wishful vision of a more democratic future proved naive. Instead, new technologies now afford rulers fresh methods for preserving power that in many ways rival, if not improve on, police organizations, surveillance organizations like the Stasi in East Germany. Surveillance powered by artificial intelligence, for example, allows despots to automate the monitoring and tracking of their opposition in ways that are far less intrusive than traditional surveillance. Not only do these digital tools enable authoritarian regimes to cast a wider net than with human-dependent methods, they can do so with far fewer resources, using far fewer resources. No one has to pay a software program to monitor people's text messages, read their social media posts, or track their movements. In fact, in a lot of cases, we sign up for it voluntarily. And once citizens team to learn to assume that all those things are happening, they alter their behavior without the regime having to resort to physical repression. It's what happens when they make up these speech restrictions or say they're going to put in restrictions on churches talking about a particular subject. What will happen is that many people will immediately start altering what they talk about. So while there was great hope about these technologies, now people, and listen, this is the CFR group saying this is a problem. And there's been a very good series of articles, whether you like the New York Times or not. They've done a very good series of articles called The Privacy Project over the past few months, where they've pointed out the problems with the intrusiveness of the technology that's developing and being used to surveil people. And it's shocking. It's actually stunning people. This is hitting home. This was in the Columbus Dispatch just the other day. The governor and attorney general came out and announced that photos from the Bureau of Motor Vehicles and other places, police mugshots, school photos, and that type of thing are being put into a facial recognition database. Now, the statements are that, well, we'll put safeguards in place so that it won't be used, for example, to monitor faces in a crowd so we can identify the criminals in the crowd or the ne'er-do-wells in the crowd at a sporting event, like an Ohio State football game. But I don't know that those safeguards, I don't know how those safeguards will be implemented. And to be honest with you, I'm skeptical. So this is middle America, where they're using and going to use pretty extensive facial recognition technology. And it's concerning. And so I think that you need to sort of watch the interplay between the reaction in this coronavirus and the use of technology to track people. I've even seen, in fact, in the article that I showed you about the church in the article about in the Wall Street Journal about the church in South Korea, if you'll notice that little monitor there under virus surge in Korea tied to megachurch, That's a monitor showing that people are being infrared scan of people walking around in it looks like an airport or a mall. So they're tracking their temperatures to see who might have an elevated temperature. So even if you're not sick with the coronavirus, if you go to the airport and you have a temperature, you're not going anywhere. And this is what's going to happen. So flights are being, I mean, there's virtually no commercial air traffic into China now. A lot of commercial travel even within cities in China is shut down. Nobody's going to China. Now, as I said, that you can see videos of protesters on Twitter and Facebook, protesters in Iraq going to border crossings with Iran and demanding that the border crossings with Iran be shut down. This is, whether it's a big deal or not, the fact of the matter is people are treating it as a big deal, and it's causing a tremendous amount of disruption. So how this all plays out, I don't know. Now, I'm going to just talk about geopolitics a little bit. I know that there is one view of the Antichrist is that the Antichrist comes from a revived Roman Empire based in Europe. And we see people like Emmanuel Macron, and everybody gets excited that maybe he's the guy. So I'm just going to play a little clip. This is a translation of what he said at the Munich Security Conference early last week, about what he sees as his vision for Europe or what he would like to see happen. Now, this is a translation, so here it is.
I look at the world the way it looks like today, and when I look at the topics of your conference this year, we can see that there is a certain weakness of the West that has been observed. 15 years ago, we thought our values were universal values. They will always rule the world, and we are dominant in terms of military technology and so on. But now, when I look at the world, as it has looked like in the last 10 or 15 years, I can say that the values have changed and new values have added and new powers have arisen, like China. And there are regional powers that have arisen, that they are very close by and they do not share our values. There's Russia. They call for a different strategy. We are close to them. We're neighbors. We have rich resources in our neighborhood. Think of Africa. When you look at the world as it has been recently, and it will be in the next 20 or 30 years, we will lose population and Africa will explode in terms of population. Remember that. Then think of American policies, how they changed in the last few years. The government has somewhat withdrawn, or at least relations with Europe are being reviewed. So we have to take that into account. And this has reinforced me in my belief that we need a European strategy, a strategy that allows us to present ourselves as a strategic power and to view ourselves as a strategic power. The Europe I have in mind is a Europe that is sovereign, united, and democratic and acts as such. And in 10 years' time, I'd like to see a Europe that has enough leverage to act, to be sovereign when it comes to policies, to technology, migration, defense, feeding the world, and also in terms of climate protection, environmental protection, and a Europe which has relations with its neighbors, Russia and Africa and the Middle East. A Europe which has decided to define core that wants true sovereignty in the Eurozone, a Europe which is credible, and a Europe which has modernized itself and that has reviewed the rules that they believe in. It cannot be a Europe where we need majority, where we need unanimous decisions. When we look into the future, 10 or 15
In other words, to translate what he's saying is, look, we want to run things, we want to be sovereign, we want the EU to survive, and he's going to push to take that. Now let's look at the Middle East, because this is always significant in Bible prophecy. And there are some things going on. In northwest Syria, there is a very delicate situation developing. Turkey has controlled part of Syria. The red areas are the Syrian regime backed by Russia, Assad backed by Russia. The purple areas are things that the Assad government has taken over recently. What they're trying to do is they're trying to take over Idlib. The green areas to the north, that's Kurdish areas. Turkish-backed rebels have had control of Idlib for quite a while. Part of it, what Turkey wanted to do is they wanted to drive a lot of the Kurds out up around Afrin, and they were successful in doing that and took control of that. But now they want to control Idlib, and they're using sort of not so nice Islamist groups, rebel groups, and they have set up observation points. You see the red dots in that photograph on the right, the map on the right. Those are Syrian observation points, and there's been a lot of conflict over the past week or so between Turkey and Syria. Turkey's killed some Syrian troops. Syrians have killed some Turkish troops. Russia's trying to moderate between the two groups. And it's a very delicate situation. So early in the week, Erdogan announced in a speech that he wanted to, an operation was imminent in Idlib. This is what he said.
Issuing an ultimatum to Russia and Syria, Recep Tayyip Erdogan said Turkey would launch its own military operation in Idlib if the Syrian regime didn't stop its offensive on the province by the end of the month.
Negotiations will continue, but so far our demands have not been met. These are the final days for the Syrian regime to stop its offensive in Idlib. This is our final warning.
And so what they're doing is they're going into these operations, and so there have been some conflicts. This has resulted in, when you see these pictures of these cities in Syria, this is one of the good ones, what it looks like. The UN has put out things that they fear a bloodbath in Syria. People are fleeing. Estimates that 1 million people are going to be put on the road. I have a video to show a little bit of that in a moment. This sort of shows the progression of how the rebel groups, Syrian opposition, backed largely by Turkey, how they have progressed. The gray area, by the way, was the Islamic State, so you can see that that's pretty much gone. Turkey controls the northern. There's still the Kurds, but there were more Kurds in the, well, you can see where the Kurds started in January 2015. They were driven out. They were driven over to northeast Syria along the Syria-Turkey border. Now Turkey and the Syrian groups have gone in there, and the Kurds, another several 100,000 of Kurds have had to flee. It's a huge problem. But the reports this week were that the refugees that were leaving the Idlib region, it is the worst refugee crisis of the Syrian civil war. Roughly 900,000 to 1 million people are effectively on the road. Here's some little video vignettes of some of the things that are going on. You see the refugees at the top. In the two corners, upper right and lower left, you'll see some, well, in the lower right, you see the video of some of the refugee camps and the snow that are taking place. In the upper right, you see drone footage that was on some of the Russian papers, news sites this week of the destruction in the Idlib area. In the lower left-hand corner, you see a major 4-lane highway in Syria that's virtually empty. The Syrian government has taken control of that. The destruction is just positively mind-boggling. And this man that was interviewed up above, he said, listen, if I can't return to my land, my heart will die. And then you see this poster there of Assad and Putin and one of the leaders of the Syrian army. So this is really amazing. Here's a video from, I think, the Wall Street Journal to give you sort of an idea of, I mean, people are packing up everything and where are they going? They don't know. So Erdogan's using this to threaten to unleash more refugees into Europe if they don't pay him. It's a major problem. At the same time that this is going on, so everybody's focusing on northwestern Syria. Jonathan Spire has a great article in the Jerusalem Post the other day, and he builds on an article that I think I have showed or talked about here that was at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, talking about how Iran has taken over Syria by going in and taking over effectively like a Boy Scouts organization. They have trained them in Shia ideology. They've indoctrinated them to accept Shiism as their religion, because Iran's looking at this from the long term. And so that in the southwest and the regions around southern Syria and along the Golan Heights, Iran is moving or signing up effectively soldiers to work on their behalf in those particular areas. Jonathan writes in the Jerusalem Post, and he says, events in Syria's southwest matter for Israel because the chaos and the continued weakness of the Syrian state allow Iran to advance by stealth, organizing in the direction of Israel's border. More broadly, Daraa, that's where the Syrian civil war really started in March of 2011, and Kenitra are worth watching with care because they show that contrary to the impression conveyed in the regime and Russian propaganda, normality is not returning to Syria with the advance of the regime's flag. Rather, in Syria's wild southwest, what exists is a chaotic, failed state, thoroughly penetrated by outside powers and facing an ongoing, inchoate, but deadly insurgency at the hands of those it claims to have vanquished. So that's a big problem. The other thing, for example, in Israel, the Jordan Valley area is very much unsettled by what has taken place with regard to talk about Israel annexing the Jordan Valley. If you look, you see the little black dots along the Jordan Valley. Those are Arab villages that are concerned that they're going to end up under Israel. Over on the other side, there are Arab villages that want to stay part of Israel, that the Trump plan would put in everything. So this whole thing is in very much a state of flux. I will say, and just one comment about Trump's plan, the one thing that it really did that was well done was it effectively says there will be no right of return of all these Palestinian refugees. And so these countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Syria that have never integrated the Palestinians into their society are going to have to deal with that issue. They're not going to be able to shove that off onto Israel. Caroline Glick has a great article in Israel Hayom this week saying the massive but reversible defeats of Iran and Turkey. Look, Iran is in turmoil. Turkey is in turmoil. Economically, they're both in turmoil. And they're in a difficult position. But whatever difficult position they've been put in by sanctions from governments, and particularly the United States government, financial sanctions on both Turkey and Iran, pretty draconian ones on Iran, and even additional ones announced this week. Unless if there's any relenting in that pressure, it will be reversed, and Israel will have a bigger problem, and people in the West will have a bigger problem because of the ideology of the Iranian regime. And yet this week, reports that Democratic senators met with Foreign Minister Zarif of Iran at the Munich Security Conference, with John Kerry sort of instructing him about how to get around sanctions. You can call that treason if you want. It sure sounds like it to me. Israel's facing an election in a few weeks, I guess a couple weeks. And so this is a poll. This is at Israel Hayom the other day, and you can see that things have not really changed, that the right parties, Likud, and the right religious parties have 56. The left has 44. The Joint Arab List has 13. And Yisrael Beteinu under Avigdor Lieberman has 7. At least this was a poll the other day. And they're like polls anywhere else. So blue and white would have to get the Joint Arab List and Lieberman's party to have a majority. That would give them 64. But if Lieberman joined with the Netanyahu coalition, they would have 63 and they would have the majority. So who knows what's going to be on. Here's yet another poll. This is from Israel National News. And it shows really that a little bit different. The blue and white coalition has 55. The Likud-led coalition has 58. And but they still, somebody needs Lieberman. So this is just with a short time to go. Netanyahu's indictment will be read in court shortly. And now there are reports that Danny Gantz is under, the blue and white leader is under investigation for things regarding a company that he had for a while. And the statement being that, look, if I get indicted, I won't lead the government. So here, I mean, everything is in a complete state of flux. So that's interesting. So I want to close with this. Phil Haney wrote a book a few years ago called See Something, Say Nothing. Phil Haney was found in California Friday afternoon, shot in the chest, and he was dead. He had gone to be with the Lord. Phil was a friend of mine. I got a call from a mutual friend about an hour and a half after they found the body. I notified some other people who were friends of Phil, mutual friends. They had not yet heard. One of them told me that I was just texting with Phil on Wednesday. And the reports are that he disappeared, went missing. Either he was visiting his sister in the Sierra foothills of Northern California between Sacramento and Lake Tahoe, went missing Wednesday night or Thursday, and they found the body around 4 o'clock California time on Friday. One shot in the chest, and he was gone. I love Phil Haney. He was a very unique man. He was very humble. He was a very solid Christian. He loved Bible prophecy. There's a group that I've met with a few times. They have a convocation most years up in northeast Ohio called the Mystery of Israel. Reg Kelly and some others. Solid Christian people. They love Israel. They're concerned about the salvation of the Jewish people. Phil spoke at that conference. I was in D.C. a few years ago, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago now, maybe. And my friend Bill Caney, who's been a longtime friend, we were going to get together, spend the afternoon before I had to fly back home. And I met him over at the Mayflower Hotel, and he said, hey, there's this guy some people want me to meet. He's supposed to meet us on the other entrance to the hotel here in a few minutes. So we walked out, and there was this guy parking on the street there, and it was a little pickup truck, and it was Phil Haney. And I recognized Phil from Fox News. I said, I didn't know the name. I said, I've seen you on Fox. You look very familiar. And he said to me, he said, you look familiar to me too. I've seen you on YouTube. So that started a friendship. We got together whenever we could when we were in different places. Would sit and talk to him for several hours at a time. And Phil was a solid Christian, a humble man. He had worked for Homeland Security. He had exposed a lot of terror networks. The Obama administration brought him up on charges and forced him to delete records tying various terrorist organizations together. And that information probably would have prevented the San Bernardino massacre and the one that occurred down in Orlando. Phil studied that. He understood that the Salafist Islamists were not sort of like radical Islamists. Salafist means original. They wanted to be like Muhammad. And he had a grasp and understanding of that, and part of it became from his training. He was an entomologist. As he would say, I'm a bug guy. I'm a nerd, John. That's what he would say. And he was so he had this self-deprecating humor. He had a wife who he dearly loved, and she had a long time battle with cancer. She passed away about a year ago. Phil had met a lady in the last recent months and was going to get married in April. There are some reports that it's a suicide. I can tell you that nobody that knows Phil Haney believes that. This man, he was working on a book. He was going to expose further things, and he's whatever the circumstances of her death, this is a great loss for America. He was a true patriot, a great Christian. He loved Bible prophecy. You can find on YouTube, you can find a picture of him. He wrote a song for his wife, Francesca Franny, who passed away last year, singing it in Jerusalem, where he loved to go because he loved the Jewish people so. Yesterday was really difficult. And you look at all these things going on in the world, and it's very easy to get upset. What's going to happen to us? We're going to go persecution. How bad will it get? Scripture says it's going to get pretty bad. There are a lot of different views as to how bad it gets before the church is out of here. But the church is being persecuted all over the world. So let me just close with this, Romans chapter 8. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? As it is written, for thy sake we are killed all the day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. We need to rest in that promise. Father, we thank you so much for the great promises of your word. Help us rest in that comfort. Pray that you'll be with Phil's family and comfort and friends, and comfort them at this time of this great tragedy that took place. Just pray that people will persevere and help continue the work that Phil started, not only in his work on national security issues, but in the teaching that he so loved to do from the Bible, and particularly the prophetic scriptures. Bless us this week. In Jesus' name, amen.